10. The French Revolution and the American Conservative Counter-Revolution. Drucker some years ago challenged as fallacious the belief that the origins of the American Revolution were to be found in the Enlightenment, and denied also that the American Revolution was a forerunner of the French. Instead, he asserted, quote, "The American Revolution was based on principles completely contrary to those of the Enlightenment and the French Revolution. In intention and effect, it was a successful counter-movement against the very rationalist despotism of the Enlightenment, which provided the political foundation for the French Revolution. Though the French Revolution happened later in time, it had politically and philosophically been anticipated by the American Revolution. The conservatives of 1776 and 1787 fought and overcame the spirit of the French Revolution, so that the American development actually represents a more advanced stage in history than the États Généraux, the Terror, and Napoleon. Far from being a revolt against the old tyranny of feudalism, the American Revolution was a conservative counter-revolution in the name of freedom against the new tyranny of rationalist liberalism and enlightened despotism. The freedom of the Western world during the 19th century and up to this day has been based upon the ideas, principles, and institutions of the American conservative counter-revolution of 1776. The American Revolution brought victory and power to a group which in Europe had been almost completely defeated and which was apparently dying out rapidly. The anti-centralist, anti-totalitarian conservatives, with their hostility to absolute and centralized government and their distrust of any ruler claiming perfection, end quote. The success of the American Revolution, adds Drucker, defeated the Enlightenment in England and enabled the conservative thought of Burke to gain ascendancy there. Drucker's characterization of the American Revolt as the, quote, conservative counter-revolution, end quote, is perhaps the best single description of that cause. The attempts of Beard, Jameson, Parrington, and others to read a contrary temper into the American Revolution cannot be sustained. Malin's blunt judgment with reference to Parrington is clearly in order. Quote, "The most conspicuous example of this combined social science literary degradation of American history was Vernon L. Parrington's Main Currents of American Thought. It belongs to the same class as Hitler's Mein Kampf in debasing history to the level of vicious propaganda in support of a social program being imposed upon a nation." End quote. The differences between the two revolutions were noted by many persons other than Burke. Thus, Friedrich Gentz, 1764 to 1832, advisor to Metternich and secretary to the Congress of Vienna, in 1810 called attention to four essential differences. First, the American Revolution was grounded upon firmly established legal principles and traditions, whereas the French Revolution moved on obviously illegal and unprincipled premises. Second, the American Revolution was defensive, a battle by Americans to preserve their liberties and continue their legitimate development, whereas the French was, quote, from beginning to end, in the highest sense of the word, an offensive revolution, end quote. Third, the American Revolution had a fixed, definite, limited, and particularistic objective, whereas the French had none, but rather moved in terms of, quote, arbitrary will and of a boundless anarchy, end quote. Fourth, the American Revolution, because of its limited and legal nature, met with limited resistance, whereas the French could only, quote, force its way by violence and crimes, end quote. The New Englander, Thomas Paine, who changed his name to Robert Treat Paine to avoid confusion with the Englishman who wrote The Rights of Man in, quote, Adams and Liberty, end quote, 1798, written when war with France seemed imminent, saw the difference as one between, quote, anarch's pestilent worm, end quote, and America's, quote-unquote, laws and her long tradition, which he compared to, quote, imperial oak, whose roots, like our liberties, ages have nourished, end quote. While France, her huge limbs bathes recumbent in blood, and society's base threats with wide dissolution, May peace like the dove who returned from the flood find an ark of abode in our mild constitution. 'Tis the fire of the light each American warms. Let Rome's haughty victors beware of collision. Let them bring all the vassals of Europe in arms. We're a world by ourselves and disdain a division. The French Revolution represented the violent culmination of three major forces. First, the ideas of the Enlightenment found their major expression and application in a radical and thorough fashion in the French Revolution. It was seen as man's opportunity to reorder history and remake man in terms of the light of this philosophy. Second, it was the triumph as well as the bloodbath hope of various Illuminist societies, secret and subversive, dedicated to the same faith as the Enlightenment philosophers, but with organized strategies added. Third, it represented the culmination of a statist tradition in France. Extensive social legislation in the face of unemployment, famine, flood, fire, epizootics, and plague, and which established hospitals, asylums, family welfare, educational aid, pensions, and the like characterized the French monarchy. Private charity and individual responsibility were steadily replaced by welfare legislation. The revolution thus presented itself as the total caretaker state in fulfillment of what the monarchy had begun. Quote, from the early days of the revolution, relief was declared to be a national obligation, a debt that the state owed to its citizens. In words, the revolutionists probably went further than the old regime, but in deeds they merely followed policy that had long been established under the old regime. End quote. In England, however, these problems were steadily met in the 16th and 17th centuries by an immense outpouring of private, charitable wealth, so that educational, charitable and reforming goals were achieved through societal rather than statist agencies. The result was, quote, a quiet but veritable revolution, end quote. The American tradition represents a continuation of this English quote-unquote revolution, and the extensive development of associations, charities, foundations, colleges, schools, and the worldwide missionary movement are aspects of this progression. The three major expressions of the philosophy of the Enlightenment have been, first, the French Revolution, second, Darwin and the mythology of evolution, and third, the Russian Revolution and its Marxian theories. A number of premises and presuppositions govern this developed faith, and an understanding of them is basic to a comprehension of contemporary history. First, this philosophy implies a rejection of the past and of history. Quote, the French Revolution, which felt the need of a new year one and a new calendar, was a revolution against history. End quote. According to this faith, God's time must be supplanted by man's time, and God's total government and decree by man's total government and decree. This philosophy holds that the clean slate concept of mind is basic to true education, so that education is not development but conditioning. This concept, applied to history, sees revolution as the historical clean slate. The past is wiped out in order that history may begin afresh. With the French, a new calendar marked a new era in time. The culmination of this new time, the revolutionary era, will be, for Marxism and the Communist International, the end of history. Whether justified in the name of reason, before Darwin, or of science, after Darwin, the philosophy of the Enlightenment is anti-historical. Burke opposed the French Revolution because of its anti-historical and anti-Christian nature, but supported the American Revolution because it was the true fulfillment of a Christian development in history. The clean slate conception of the mind had ancient roots, but it came into its own in the Enlightenment. Second, as a corollary to the first, there is a rejection of institutions and customs inherited from the past which are deemed to be either non-rational or unscientific. As a result, there is a hostility to religion, marriage, and the family in terms of this faith, a hostility to everything indeed except the state. Everything is thus eroded down to two components, man and the state, and man is the creature of the state and has no transcendence in relation to it. Third, evil is not in human nature, which is either good or at least neutral, but it is in the environment. Man is hence malleable. The state, by reordering the environment, will be able to create a perfect humanity. Quote, by changing human institutions, human nature itself will be born again. End quote. Redemption is thus political action, not religious faith, and statism is made necessary to man. Horace Mann held that state schools would eliminate crime, slums, prisons, and all human ills. Socialists hold that state actions will accomplish the same purpose through politico-economic legislation. The champions of a welfare economy or interventionism believe that housing projects will end slums, poverty, and delinquency. With every form of this faith, empiricism prevails. External measures and impressions will govern the mind and nature of man, which is essentially passive. Even the creative rationalism of Kant is at this point empirical. It rests on the prior empirical experience, which then leads to a creative response. As against all this, the US Constitution was not written in terms of any faith in the essential goodness of man, an article of the new faith, but in terms of checks and balances, a distrust of man. Fourth, the new managers of society must be scientists, educators, and politicians, the new philosopher kings, men who move in terms of science and quote-unquote scientific education, political theory, and economics. These, whether called planners, managers, civil servants, or the dictatorship of the proletariat, are assumed to be able to institute efficacious control and alter the nature of man by proper state action. This elite, moving in terms of reason or science, can remake man and society. It is seen not as a power elite, but as objective and selfless, and as expression of scientific reason. Fifth, it is held by this philosophy that man and society are basically secular, non-theistic or atheistic rather than religious. Therefore, Christianity is at best peripheral rather than essential to man, society, and civil government. Modern society is thus non-religious or irreligious by principle. Sixth, the supremacy of science is asserted. Kant saw three stages of thought. First, the theological or fictitious. Second, the metaphysical or abstract. Third, scientific or positive thought. Comte's formulation sharpened a long-developed faith. More important, Kant, in holding that scientific thought is not concerned with causes or meaning as the means to desired results, thereby furthered the triumph of methodology over meaning. Hence, methodology is more important than content in scientific education. Hence also the extensive unconcern of scientists with the meaning of their activity. Science is methodology. Hence again the establishment of democracy is seen as the cure-all for all cultures, since methodology will remake man. Democracy is thus applied to Asiatic, African, and Latin American states without any regard for their historical and cultural conditions, because it is assumed that the former method is the creator of valid objectives. This concept governs the United Nations and US State Department policies and the activities of the Communist International as well. Methodology is creative and has priority. Methodology then imposes a radically different conception of life upon man. Methodology is both functional and economical. It is concerned with the shortest distance between 2 points. It wants to eliminate what seems to be unessential from this scientific perspective. The family and private property are both uneconomical and non-functional in this sense and must be eliminated. Test tube babies or controlled heredity have thus been proposed as more efficient. Indeed, it has even been suggested that men be wired at birth with sockets for central agency control. Total planning and control are inescapable conclusions of this priority of methodology. So too is simplism. Bark has called attention to one of the central failures of Rome, the confusion of, quote, simplicity with strength, as if one could not exist without the other, end quote. This Roman hunger for simplicity has been surpassed in the scientific ideal of simplicity in hypothesis and method, a religious axiom in essence. This triumph of methodology has been erosive of everything except the power of the scientific state to control, remake, and absolutely govern men. The supremacy of science has also meant the reinterpretation of life in terms of scientific categories. This appears, as we have seen, in the application of the mathematical concept of equality to men. The term quote-unquote equality has reference to an abstraction, and more than that, to an abstraction of a particular variety, quantitative abstraction. To apply the term as scientific political theory does to the variety, concreteness, and richness of the human situation is at once to do it a radical injustice and to introduce unrealism and injustice into the political order. Can one man equal another man, or a woman or a tree equal a cloud? The biblical doctrine is not equality or inequality, but calling, which presupposes the necessity and value of differences. Each has his necessary place and honour and dignity in terms of his calling and his faithful discharge thereof. The idea of, quote, a science of man, end quote, presupposes the validity of abstractions and generalizations in knowing and describing man. The biblical faith defines man in terms of the image of God. Man has as his federal head either Adam or Christ, but in either case he has a vast variety of different and irreducible potentialities of calling which negate abstraction. There is unity in either Adam or in Christ, but no possible reduction to either Adam or Christ. The science of man is thus scientific mythology. The modern idea of democracy is based in part on scientific abstraction or reduction. Seventh, because this philosophy seeks to remake man, it is hostile to the idea of punishment. Punishment assumes two things. First, responsibility on the part of the criminal, and second, the limitation of the civil government's authority over a man to a specific and overt act of crime and to a specific, limited and overt punishment thereof. The idea of crime as mental sickness denies limitation and places man totally in the hands of the state. As Lewis has noted, punishment is, quote, always finite. You could do so much to the criminal and no more. Remedial treatment, on the other hand, need have no fixed limit. It could go on till it had effected a cure, and those who were carrying it out would decide when that was. And if cure were humane and desirable, how much more prevention? Soon anyone who had ever been in the hands of the police at all would come under control in the end, every citizen, end quote. Eighth, the French Revolution was the beginning of democracy in army service, that is, modern conscription. Such conscription began as, and is increasingly, a political device serving two functions. First, it enables a state to control the populace more effectively, as well as to have an opportunity for indoctrination. Second, its purpose is to weaken and break up, as far as possible, the military power in the state. In a professional army, the relationship of officers to men is a close one, and the officer both knows his troops and is able to judge their minds, morale, and potentiality. He is thus in a position, when the government is weak, to overthrow the government, because he moves in terms of an assurance in his men. A conscript army is an army of strangers, often at odds with its officers, not comparable to a professional army in strength, but safer to the state because of these things. Conscription in the modern state is thus an instrument whereby the freedom of both the citizenry and the military is limited and weakened as an instrument of social control. Ninth, in this developed and developing philosophy, foreign policy predominates over internal policy. The messianic hopes of the French Revolution immediately involved it in a continuing war against the nations. The Russian Revolution is no less dedicated to this messianic faith, and the United States, which in recent years has undergone a second revolution, is equally certain of its role as world saviour. Interventionism is both political and economic interventionism at home goes hand in hand historically with intervention in the affairs of foreign powers. Nothing is more clear in a reading of the Old Testament than the hostility of biblical faith to this priority of foreign affairs and its concomitant interventionism. George Washington's hostility to interventionism needs no recounting, and the Monroe Doctrine was an assertion of the immunity of the Americas from interventionism. 10th, humanity is the true God of the Enlightenment and of French revolutionary thought. In all religious faiths, one of the inevitable requirements of logical thought asserts itself in a demand for the unity of the Godhead. Hence, since humanity is God, there can be no division in this Godhead, humanity. Mankind must therefore be forced to unite. Since Enlightenment philosophy is monistic, this means an intolerance of differences as unessential. National and racial differences, instead of being God-given and possessing richness and dignity to be respected, are to be obliterated. The goal is not communion, but uniformity. Again, since humanity is God, the killing of any man, either for crimes or in warfare, is an offence. The only permissible killing is possibly George Bernard Shaw's execution, quote, in a kindly manner, end quote, of the enemies of socialism. Humanistic pacifism is a result, and a pro-one world, United Nations, peace at any price faith. The Godhead must be united. This faith finds expression in the U.S. Department of State publication 7277, quote, Freedom from War, end quote, September 1961. This faith was expressed in the midst of war by Churchill and F.D. Roosevelt in Point 8 of the Atlantic Charter, and was ascribed to their governments, quote, They believe all the nations of the world, for realistic as well as spiritual reasons, must come to the abandonment of the use of force, end quote. But Scripture does not consider the legitimate use of force as an evil, but rather as a necessity and a good to be used to prevent the rise and triumph of evil. Roosevelt's faith required messianic intervention with force and at the same time a condemnation of all force. Because of this coincidence of messianic interventionism and pacifism, this philosophy has created war even where men have talked most about world peace. The very idea of a United Nations requires war, in that it insists on irreconcilable and contradictory things. First, it insists on uniting a world and levelling all differences. Anyone with a sense of integrity must inevitably resist this levelling. Second, it seeks to create a superstate which must increasingly coerce every state, civil government and person into line with its dream of messianic power. Third, it seeks to arrest history and freeze it into a particular mould in terms of Enlightenment thought. Inevitably, this faith is anti-Christian, and a conflict with Christianity is requisite to its being. 11th, the Enlightenment, French Revolution, and proponents of modern science see nature as eternal, infinite, and abundant. Hence, in this tradition, as exemplified today in Marxism and welfare states, the economic problem is primarily and essentially one of distribution, not production. To believe in nature as created is to hold to an economy of scarcity, to an awareness of the limitations of nature and the necessity of painstaking work, that is, production, to develop the limited means of nature. The untouched wilderness is thus not the land of plenty, but rather the realm of plenty is free and developed civilization, where man's labour and capital have led to productivity and a measure of cultivated abundance. 12th, as we have seen, the French Revolution destroyed the remains of feudalism and federalism in France and reduced all civil government into the hands of the central power and its departments, whereas the American Revolution was the triumph of localism over centralism and of law over majoritarianism. 13th, this philosophy, by its denial of Christianity, moved rapidly to the assumption that reality is basically impersonal. Hence, knowledge must be abstract and impersonal to be true, and society and man must be similarly impersonal. Dewey's hatred of personality presupposes this view of reality. 14th, the state school is the established quote-unquote church and mediator of salvation to man, and children are primarily to be nurtured by and for the state. 15th, as has been indicated, this philosophy is hostile to the private ownership of property. Such property as is allowed to private ownership is on the sufferance of the state and state planners. Implicit here is not only the priority of the state to its citizenry, but also the hatred of personality in terms of an impersonal conception of ultimate reality. Moreover, the social control of man, human engineering, makes pockets of immunity to control offensive. Jeremy Bentham, an English liberal and totalitarian, wanted a model prison in which, quote, one man would at all times be able to see the smallest movements of 1,000 prisoners and to control their most minute actions, end quote. This is increasingly the dream of reason for all men. The issues were very early stated by Burke in his Thoughts on French Affairs, December 1791. According to Burke, the Reformation effected a revolution in Europe by introducing supranational and transcendental issues and divisions into every locality, so that Europe became a system of Christian civil orders. The French Revolution introduced majoritarianism and total sovereignty. Between this revolution and Christian Europe, no peace was possible. In his 4, quote, letters on a regicide peace, end quote, a few years later, he declared that, whatever the strategic peace might be at any time, Jacobinism was a civil war against Europe as a Christian commonwealth, and was determined on unremitting warfare against Christianity and its, quote, utter extirpation, end quote. Either the French Revolution and its philosophy must be destroyed, or Christian Europe eventually would be, for, quote, in one word, with this republic, nothing independent can coexist. Time has not made that conflict more reconcilable. It has, however, seen the weakening of the American Revolution, which Burke saw as so very important to the cause of liberty. Historians are bent on seeing the American Revolution in terms of the Enlightenment, and political action today is extensively premised on French revolutionary concepts. But since the Communist Manifesto, Marxism and the Communist Internationale better expresses the Enlightenment and the French Revolution than does the United States, and competition between the two will work to the advantage of the more consistent system. This mixed situation, with its conflicting presuppositions, is scarcely realized by most. Indeed, there are those who have spoken of the French Revolution as Christian or Puritan in nature. Thus, Brinton sees the values of the French Revolution as, quote, mostly the traditional Christian and especially Protestant Christian virtues, end quote, and more specifically as, quote-unquote, Puritan. But his definition of this Puritanism is precisely the moralism against which the Reformation and Puritanism waged warfare, and which John Cotton in Revelation 13 saw as the mark of the beast. Failure to understand what Christianity is will logically lead to failure to understand its antithesis.